A holy man lies on his back in the dirt, arms pinned, robes torn. Around him, a mob of creatures is tearing him apart. One has claws where hands should be. One has a beak. One is covered in what looks like open sores, boils, and rotting skin. They're not attacking him in some organized, purposeful way. They're swarming him the way insects swarm something already dying. This is Saint Anthony, one of the most respected holy men in Christian history. And this painting was hung in a room specifically so that dying people could look at it. That single fact changes everything about how you're supposed to read this image. Let's start with what's directly in front of you. Saint Anthony is on the ground, overwhelmed, his holy staff and rosary barely visible in the chaos, almost useless against what's attacking him. Around him is a horde of demons unlike almost anything else painted in this period. Hybrid creatures combining animal, insect, and human anatomy in ways that feel less like medieval monster design and more like something out of a fever dream. Claws, beaks, too many joints, skin that looks diseased rather than simply demonic. This panel is part of a much larger structure called the Isenheim Altarpiece, a multi-panel folding artwork created by the German painter Matthias Grünewald, working alongside a sculptor named Niklaus of Haguenau between roughly 1512 and 1515. The Temptation of St. Anthony is one panel within what's known as the altarpiece's third view, one of several configurations the entire structure could be folded into depending on the occasion. And the level of anatomical invention in these demons is genuinely unusual for its era. Some art historians believe Grünewald studied real medical illustrations of disease and deformity circulating at the time, and applied that same unsettling realism to imaginary creatures, which is part of why they still feel disturbing 500 years later instead of quaint or cartoonish. Here's the part almost nobody knows until they're told, and it recontextualizes the entire painting instantly. This altarpiece wasn't created for a cathedral or a wealthy private chapel. It was commissioned for the chapel of a hospital run by a religious order called the Antonine monks, who specialized in treating a horrific, disfiguring disease called ergotism, sometimes known as St. Anthony's fire. Ergotism was caused by eating rye bread contaminated with a certain fungus, and it caused convulsions, hallucinations, and in severe cases gangrene, meaning patients would watch their own fingers, toes, and limbs blacken and die while they were still alive. It was agonizing, disfiguring, and, in this era, essentially untreatable. So when a hospital patient suffering exactly that kind of bodily horror looked up at this altarpiece, they weren't seeing an abstract religious allegory, they were seeing a saint who endured grotesque, disfiguring bodily torment and survived it. This painting wasn't designed primarily to frighten, it was designed to comfort people whose own bodies were already doing something just as horrifying. Once you know who this painting was actually made for, look again at the demons themselves. Several of the creatures attacking Anthony have skin covered in lesions, swellings, and discoloration that closely resemble the visible symptoms of ergotism itself. Boils, blackened patches, disfigured limbs. Some scholars argue this wasn't accidental. By giving the demons diseased, decaying flesh, Grünewald was essentially painting the patient's own affliction back at them, but externalized given form turned into something a saint could physically fight rather than simply endure helplessly. That reframes the entire scene. This isn't just a saint being punished by generic evil, it's disease itself, personified as a horde of monstrous attackers and a holy man refusing to be destroyed by it. For a dying patient in that hospital chapel, that message carried enormous weight. Your suffering has a shape, your suffering can be resisted, and even a saint had to fight through something that looked exactly like what's happening to your own body right now. Remarkably little is known for certain about Grünewald himself, which is strange given how technically accomplished and inventive this altarpiece is. Even his real name is disputed among historians. Some scholars believe his actual birth name was Matthias Gotthard Neithardt, and Grünewald may have been a later mistaken attribution. Unlike his far more famous contemporary Albrecht Dürer, who achieved international fame and left behind an enormous, well-documented body of work, Grünewald worked in relative obscurity, and fewer than a dozen securely attributed works survive from his entire career. That obscurity makes the Isenheim Altarpiece even more remarkable. A painter we barely know anything about produced one of the most technically and emotionally sophisticated religious artworks of the entire German Renaissance, seemingly without the widespread recognition that other artists of his caliber received during their lifetimes. One detail that's easy to miss if you only ever see a photograph of this panel: the Isenheim Altarpiece wasn't a single fixed image. It was built with folding wings, meaning the monks running the hospital could physically change which scenes were visible depending on the liturgical calendar. On ordinary days, patients might see a calmer, more comforting scene. On specific feast days, the wings would be folded back to reveal darker, more intense imagery, including this demonic attack on St. Anthony. That means the hospital had direct control over exactly when its patients were confronted with this level of horror, using it deliberately, at specific moments, rather than displaying it constantly. That's a strikingly sophisticated use of religious art as something closer to a therapeutic tool, deployed with intention rather than simply decoration hung once and left unchanged. The hospital in Isenheim eventually closed. Ergotism became far better understood and largely preventable, and the specific medical context that shaped this altarpiece slowly faded from public memory. But the painting's influence didn't fade with it. Centuries later, German expressionist painters working in the aftermath of the First World War, including Otto Dix and Max Beckmann, looked directly back to Grünewald's raw, anguished, unflinching treatment of suffering bodies as a precedent for depicting the horrors of modern warfare. Artists trying to paint mustard gas victims, amputees, and shattered soldiers found a 500-year-old hospital altarpiece more useful than almost anything produced in between. That's a rare kind of afterlife for a religious commission. A painting made to comfort dying hospital patients in a small French town became, centuries later, one of the key visual references for artists trying to process an entirely different, modern kind of mass suffering. The complete Isenheim Altarpiece is now housed at the Unsettling Museum in Colmar, France, where it remains one of the most visited works of religious art in Europe, drawing visitors who often arrive knowing nothing about ergotism, the Antonine monks, or the hospital this altarpiece was originally built for. Which raises an interesting question about how differently the same image can function depending entirely on who's standing in front of it. To a modern museum visitor, this panel reads as pure horror, monstrous, grotesque, unsettling. To the patient, it was actually painted for 500 years ago, staring up at it from a hospital bed with a disease slowly consuming their own body. It likely read as something closer to hope. So the next time someone calls this one of the most disturbing paintings ever made, remember who it was actually made for. Grünewald wasn't just painting a saint being tortured by demons, he was painting a message for people whose bodies were already being tortured, telling them, in the most extreme visual language he had, that even this could be survived.